This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 1. Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what's the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversation? So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time it all seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it, and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and fortunately was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her and to wonder what was going to happen next. First she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well, and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labelled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody, so she managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this I shall think nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll all think me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it even if I fell off the top of a house, which was very likely true. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see, that would be 4,000 miles down, I think. For you see, Alice had learnt several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her, still it was good practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance. But then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to. Alice had no idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but thought they were nice grand words to say. Presently she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downward. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word. But I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And she tried to curtsy as she spoke. Fancy curtsying as you're falling through the air. Do you think you could manage it? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. Down, down, down. There was nothing else to do, so Alice soon began talking again. Dinah'll miss me very much tonight, I should think. Dinah was the cat. I hope they'll remember her saucer of milk at tea time. Dinah, my dear, I wish you were down here with me. There are no mice in the air, I'm afraid, but you might catch a bat, and that's very like a mouse, you know. But do cats eat bats, I wonder? And here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself in a dreamy sort of way, Do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't much matter which way she put it. She felt that she was dozing off, and had just begun to dream that she was walking hand in hand with Dinah, and saying to her very earnestly, Now, Dinah, tell me the truth, did you ever eat a bat? When suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves, and the fall was over. Alice was not a bit hurt, and she jumped up on her feet in a moment. She looked up, but it was all dark overhead. Before her was another long passage, and the white rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. There was not a moment to be lost. Away went Alice like the wind, and was just in time to hear it say, as it turned a corner, "Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it's getting!" She was close behind it when she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. She found herself in a long, low hall, which was lit up by a row of lamps hanging from the roof. There were doors all around the hall, but they were all locked, and when Alice had been all the way down one side and up the other, trying every door, she walked sadly down the middle, wondering how she was ever to get out again. Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table, all made of solid glass. There was nothing on it except a tiny golden key, and Alice's first thought was that it might belong to one of the doors of the hall. But alas, either the locks were too large or the key was too small, but at any rate it would not open any of them. However, on the second time round she came upon a low curtain she had not noticed before, and behind it was a little door about 15 inches high. She tried the little golden key in the lock, and to her great delight it fitted. Alice opened the door and found it led into a small passage, not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage into the loveliest garden you ever saw. How she longed to get out of that dark hall and wander about among those beds of bright flowers and those cool fountains, but she could not even get her head through the doorway. And even if my head would go through, thought poor Alice, it would be of very little use without my shoulders. Oh, how I wish I could shut up like a telescope! I think I could, if I only know how to begin. For you see, so many out-of-the-way things had happened lately, that Alice had begun to think that very few things indeed were really impossible. There seemed to be no use in waiting by the little door, so she went back to the table, half hoping she might find another key on it, or at any rate a book of rules for shutting people up like telescopes. This time she found a little bottle on it, which certainly was not here before, said Alice, and round the neck of the bottle was a paper label, with the words "Drink me" beautifully printed on it in large letters. It was all very well to say "drink me," but the wise little Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. "No, I'll look first," she said, "and see whether it's marked poison or not," for she had read several nice little histories about children who'd gotten burnt and eaten up by wild beasts and other unpleasant things, all because they would not remember the simple rules their friends had taught them, such as that a red-hot poker will burn you if you hold it too long, and that if you cut your finger very deeply with a knife it usually bleeds. And she had never forgotten that if you drink much from a bottle marked poison, it's almost certain to disagree with you sooner or later. However, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and finding it very nice, it had, in fact, a sort of mixed flavour of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She very soon finished it off. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be shutting up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into that lovely garden. First, however, she waited for a few minutes, to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this, "for it might end, you know," said Alice to herself, "in my going out altogether like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then." And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember having ever seen such a thing. After a while, finding that nothing more happened, she decided on going into the garden at once. But alas for poor Alice, when she got to the door, she found she'd forgotten the little golden key, and when she went back to the table for it, she found she could not possibly reach it. She could see it quite plainly through the glass, and she tried her best to climb up one of the legs of the table, but it was too slippery, and when she had tired herself out with trying, the poor little thing sat down and cried. "Come, there's no use crying like that," said Alice to herself rather sharply. "I advise you to leave off this minute." She generally gave herself very good advice, though she very seldom followed it, and sometimes she scolded herself so severely as to bring tears into her eyes. She once remembered trying to box her own ears for having cheated herself in a game of croquet she was playing against herself, for this curious child was fond of pretending to be two people. "But it's no use now," thought poor Alice, "to pretend to be two people. Why, there's hardly enough of me to make one respectable person." Soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it, and found in it a very small cake, on which the words "Eat me" were beautifully marked in currants. "Well, I'll eat it," said Alice, "and if it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. So either way I'll get into the garden, and I don't care which happens." She ate a little bit, and said anxiously to herself, "Which way? Which way?" holding her hand on the top of her head to feel which way it was growing, and she was quite surprised to find that she remained the same size. To be sure, this generally happens when one eats cake, but Alice had gotten so much into the way of expecting nothing but out-of-the-way things to happen, that it seemed quite dull and stupid for life to go on in the common way. So she set to work, and very soon finished off the cake. End of Chapter 1. Read by Krista McQuillan, Tokyo, Japan, November 15th, 2005.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brad Bush. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 2. The Pool of Tears. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. She was so much surprised that for the moment she quite forgot how to speak good English. "Now I'm opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet." For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed to be almost out of sight, they were getting so far off. "Oh, my poor little feet! I wonder who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears. I'm sure I shan't be able to. I shall be a great deal too far off to trouble myself about you. You must manage the best you can, but I must be kind to them," thought Alice, "or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Let me see, I'll give them a new pair of boots every Christmas." And she went on planning to herself how she should manage it. They must go by carrier, she thought, and how funny I'll seem sending presents to one's own feet, and how odd the directions will look. Alice's right foot, Esquire. Hearthrug near the fender, with Alice's love. Oh dear, what nonsense I'm talking! Just then her head struck against the roof of the hall. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high, and she at once took up the little golden key and hurried off to the garden door. Poor Alice! It was as much as she could do, lying down on one side, to look into the garden with one eye, but to get through was more hopeless than ever. She sat down and began to cry again. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "A great girl like you," she might well say this, "to go on crying in this way. Stop this moment, I tell you." But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears, until there was a large pool all around her, about 4 inches deep, and reaching half down the hall. After a time she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance, and she hastily dried her eyes to see what was coming. It was the White Rabbit returning, splendidly dressed, with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. He came trotting along in a great hurry, muttering to himself as he came, "Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess! Oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting?" Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask help of anyone. So when the rabbit came near her, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit started violently, dropped the white kid gloves and the fan, and scurried away into the darkness, as hard as he could go. Alice took up the fan and gloves, and, as the hall was very hot, she kept fanning herself all the time she went on talking. "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today, and yesterday things went on just as usual. I wonder if I've been changed in the night. Let me think, was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle." And she began thinking over all the children that she knew that were of the same age as herself, to see if she could have been changed for any of them. "I'm sure I'm not Ada," she said, "for her hair goes in such long ringlets, and mine doesn't go in ringlets at all. And I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things. And she, oh, she knows such a very little. Besides, she, and I'm I. And oh dear, how puzzling it all is. I'll try if I know all the things I used to know. Let me see, 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is... Oh dear! I shall never get to 20 at that rate. However, the multiplication table doesn't signify. Let's try geography. London is the capital of Paris, and Paris is the capital of Rome, and Rome— No, that's all wrong, I'm certain. I must have been changed for Mabel. I'll try and say, how doth the little— and she crossed her hands on her lap as if she were saying lessons, and began to repeat it, but her voice sounded hoarse and strange, and the words did not come the same as they used to. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spread his claws, and welcome little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. I'm sure those are not the right words, said poor Alice, and her eyes filled with tears again as she went on. I must be Mabel after all, and I shall have to go and live in that poky little house, and have next to no toys to play with, and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. It'll be no use their putting their heads down and saying, Come up again, dear. I shall only look up and say, Who am I, then? Tell me that first, and then, if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else. But, oh dear, cried Alice, with a sudden burst of tears, I do wish they would put their heads down. I am so very tired of being all alone here. As she said this, she looked down at her hands, and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white kid gloves while she was talking. How can I have done that? She thought. I must be growing small again. She got up and went to the table to measure herself by it, and found that, as nearly as she could guess, she was now about 2 feet high, and was going on shrinking rapidly. She soon found out that the cause of this was the fan that she was holding, and she dropped it hastily, just in time to avoid shrinking away altogether. That was a narrow escape, said Alice, a good deal frightened at the sudden change, but very glad to find herself still in existence. And now for the garden, and she ran with all speed back to the little door. But alas, the door was shut again, and the little golden key was lying on the glass table as before. And things are worse than ever, thought the poor child, for I never was so small as this before, never, and I declare it's too bad, that it is. As she said these words, her foot slipped, and in another moment, splash, she was up to her chin in salt water. Her first idea was that she had somehow fallen into the sea. And in that case I can go back by railway, she said to herself. Alice had been to the seaside once in her life, and had come to the general conclusion that wherever you go on the English coast, you find a number of bathing machines in the sea, some children digging in the sand with wooden spades, then a row of lodging-houses, and behind them a railway station. However, she soon made out that she was in a pool of tears, which she had wept when she was 9 feet high. I wish I hadn't cried so much, said Alice, as she swam about, trying to find her way out. I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears. That will be a queer thing, to be sure. However, everything is queer today. Just then she heard something splash about in the pool a little way off, and she swam nearer to make out what it was. At first she thought it must be a walrus or hippopotamus, but then she remembered how small she was now, and she soon made out that it was only a mouse that had slipped in like herself. Would it be of any use now, thought Alice, to speak to this mouse? Everything is so out of the way down here that I should think very likely it can talk. At any rate, there's no harm in trying. So she began, Oh, Mouse, do you know the way out of this pool? I am very tired of swimming about here. Oh, Mouse! Alice thought this must be the right way of speaking to a mouse. She had never done such a thing before, but she remembered having seen her brother's Latin grammar, a mouse of a mouse, to a mouse, oh mouse. The mouse looked at her rather inquisitively, and seemed to her to wink with one of its little eyes, but it said nothing. Perhaps it doesn't understand English, thought Alice. I dare say it's a French mouse, come over with William the Conqueror. With all her knowledge of history, Alice had no clear notion how long ago anything had happened. So she began again, "Où est mon chat?" which was the first sentence in her French lesson book. The mouse gave a sudden leap out of the water and seemed to quiver all over with fright. "Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice hastily, afraid that she had hurt the poor animal's feelings. "I quite forgot you don't like cats." "Not like cats!" cried the mouse in a shrill, passionate voice. "Would you like cats if you were me?" "Well, perhaps not," said Alice in a soothing tone. "Don't be angry about it. And yet I wish I could show you our cat, Dinah. I think you'd take a fancy to cats if you could only see her. She's such a dear, quiet thing," Alice went on half to herself, as she swam lazily about in the pool. "And she sits purring so nicely by the fire, licking her paws and washing her face, and she is such a nice, soft thing to nurse, and she's such a capital one for catching mice. Oh, I beg your pardon," cried Alice again, for this time the mouse was bristling all over, and she felt certain it must be really offended. "We won't talk about her any more, if you'd rather not." "We, indeed!" cried the mouse, who was trembling down to the end of his tail. "As if I would talk on such a subject! Our family always hated cats. Nasty, low, vulgar things. Don't let me hear the name again." "I won't indeed," said Alice, in a great hurry to change the subject of conversation. "And you, are you fond of dogs?" The mouse did not answer, so Alice went on eagerly. "There is such a nice little dog near our house I should like to show you. A little bright-eyed terrier, you know, with, oh, such long curly brown hair, and it'll fetch things when you throw them, and it'll sit up and beg for its dinner, and all sorts of things. I can't remember half of them, and it belongs to a farmer, you know, and he says it's so useful, it's worth £100. He says it kills all the rats and—" "Oh, dear!" cried Alice in a sorrowful tone. "I'm afraid I've offended again." For the mouse was swimming away from her as hard as it could go, and making quite a commotion in the pool as it went. So she called softly after it, "Mouse dear, do come back again, and I won't talk about cats, or dogs either, if you don't like them." When the mouse heard this, it turned round and swam slowly back to her. Its face was quite pale, with passion, Alice thought, and it said in a low, trembling voice, "Let us get to the shore, and then I'll tell you my history, and you'll understand why it is that I hate cats and dogs." It was high time to go, for the pool was getting quite crowded with birds and animals that had fallen into it. There was a duck and a dodo, a lory and an eaglet, and several other curious creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to the shore. End of chapter 2.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox, LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger W. Barnett. Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 3. A Caucus Race and a Long Tale. They were indeed a queer-looking party that assembled on the bank. The birds with draggled feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross, and uncomfortable. The first question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this, and after a few minutes it seemed quite natural to Alice to find herself talking familiarly with them as if she had known them all her life. Indeed, she had quite a long argument with the lory, who at last turned sulky and would only say, "I am older than you and must know better." And this Alice would not allow without knowing how old it was, and as the lorry positively refused to tell its age, there was no more to be said. At last the mouse, who seemed to be a person of authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once, in a large ring, with the mouse in the middle. Alice kept her eyes anxiously fixed on it, for she felt sure she would catch a bad cold if she did not get dry very soon. "Ahem," said the mouse with an important air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please." William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders, and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria— "Ugh!" said the lorry with a shiver. "I beg your pardon," said the mouse, frowning, but very politely. "Did you speak?" "Not I," said the lorry hastily. "I thought you did," said the mouse. I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable— "Found what?" said the duck. "Found it," the mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course you know what it means." "I know what it means well enough when I find a thing," said the duck. "It's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" The mouse did not notice this question, but hurriedly went on. "Found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct was at first moderate, but the insolence of his Normans— How are you getting on now, my dear?" it continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all." "In that case," said the dodo solemnly, rising to its feet, "I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies." "Speak English," said the eaglet. "I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and, what's more, I don't believe you do either." And the eaglet bent down its head to hide a smile. Some of the other birds tittered audibly. "What I was going to say," said the dodo in an offended tone, "was that the best thing is to get us dry would be a caucus race." "What is a caucus race?" said Alice. Not that she wanted much to know, but the dodo had paused, as if it thought that somebody ought to speak, and no one else seemed inclined to say anything. "Why," said the dodo, "the best way to explain it is to do it. and you might like to try the thing yourself some winter day. I will tell you how the dodo managed it. First, it marked out a race course in a sort of circle. The exact shape doesn't matter, it said. And then all the party were placed along the course, here and there. There was no 1, 2, 3, and away, but they began running when they liked, and left off when they liked, so that it was not easy to know when the race was over. However, when they had been running half an hour or so, and were quite dry again, the dodo suddenly called out, "The race is over!" And they all crowded round it, panting and asking, "But who has won?" This question the dodo could not answer without a great deal of thought. And
This
it
is a
sat for
LibriVox
long
recording.
time
All LibriVox
with
recordings
one finger
are in the public
pressed upon
domain.
its
For
forehead,
more information or to
the
volunteer, please
position
visit
in which you usually see
LibriVox.org.
Shakespeare in the pictures of
Today's
him,
reading by Kara Schallenberg.
while the rest waited in silence. At last,
www.kray.org.
the dodo said,
Alice's
"Everybody
Adventures
has
in
won,
Wonderland by Lewis
and
Carroll.
all must have
Chapter
prizes.
7. A Mad
But
Tea
who
Party.
is to give the prizes?"
There was a
Quite
table
a
set out
chorus
under a
of
tree in
voices
front of the
asked.
house, and
"Why,
the March Hare
she,
and the
of
Hatter were
course,"
having tea at
said
it.
the dodo,
A dormouse was
pointing
sitting
to
between them,
Alice with
fast
one
asleep,
finger.
and the other
And
two
the
were
whole
using it as a
party at
cushion,
once
resting their
crowded
elbows on it
round her,
and talking over its head.
calling out in a confused
Very uncomfortable
way,
for the dormouse,
"Prizes!
thought Alice.
Prizes!"
Only, as it's asleep,
Alice
I suppose
had
it doesn't
no
mind.
idea what to do.
The
and in
table was a large
despair,
one, but the
she
three were
put
all
her
crowded
hand
together
in
at
her
one corner
pocket
of it.
and
"No
pulled out
room,
a
no
box
room,"
of
they cried out when they
comfits.
saw Alice coming.
Luckily, the
"There's
salt
plenty of
water
room,"
had
said
not
Alice
got into
indignantly,
it.
and she sat
and
down in
handed
a
them
large
round
armchair
as
at one
prizes.
end of the table.
There was exactly
"Have some wine," the
one
March Hare
apiece,
said, in an
all
encouraging
round.
tone. Alice looked all round the table, but there was nothing on it but
she
tea.
must have a prize
"I don't see
herself,
any
you
wine,"
know," said
she
the
remarked.
mouse.
"There isn't any,"
"Of
said the March
course,"
Hare.
the dodo replied very
"Then it wasn't very
gravely.
civil of you to
"What
offer
else
it,"
have you
said
got in your
Alice
pocket?"
angrily.
he went on.
"It wasn't very civil
turning
of
to
you
Alice.
to sit down without being invited,"
"Only a
said the March
thimble,"
Hare.
said Alice sadly.
"I didn't know it was your table,"
"Hand
said
it
Alice.
over here,"
"It's
said
laid
the
for a great
dodo.
many more than 3.
Then they all
"Your hair
crowded
wants
round
cutting,"
her
said the
once
Hatter.
more,
He
while
had been
the
looking at
dodo
Alice for some time with
solemnly
great
presented the
curiosity,
thimble,
and this was his
saying,
first speech.
"We beg your acceptance
"You should learn
of
not to
this
make personal
elegant
remarks,"
thimble."
Alice said,
And
with some severity.
When it had
"It's
finished
very
this
rude."
short speech, they all
The Hatter
cheered.
opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he
Alice
said was,
thought the whole thing
"Why
very
is a raven
absurd,
like a
but they
writing
all
desk?"
looked so grave.
"Come, we shall have
that
some
she
fun
did not
now,"
dare
thought
to
Alice.
laugh,
"I'm glad they've begun
and
asking
as
riddles.
she could not think of anything
I
to
believe I can
say,
guess that," she
she
added
simply
aloud.
bowed and
"Do you
took
mean
the
that you think you
thimble,
can find out the answer
looking
to
as
it?"
solemn
said the March
as she
Hare.
could.
"Exactly
The
so,"
next
said
thing
Alice.
was to eat the comfits.
"Then you should say what
This
you mean,"
caused
the
some
March
noise
Hare
and
went on.
confusion, as the large
"I do,"
birds
Alice
complained
hastily replied.
that
"At
they
least,
could not taste theirs,
I mean what I
and the
say.
small ones
That's the same
choked
thing, you know."
and had to be patted
"Not
on
the same
back.
thing a bit," said the Hatter.
However,
"You
it
might
was
just as
over
well
at
say that
last,
I
and they
see
sat
what I
down
eat
again in a
is the
ring
same thing as
and
I
begged
eat
the
what I
mouse
see.
to tell them something more.
You might just as well say,"
"You
added the March
promised
Hare,
to tell me
"that
your history,
I
you
like what I
know,"
get is the
said
same
Alice,
thing as I
"and
get
why
what I
it
like."
is you hate C
"You might
and
just as well
B,"
say,"
she
added the
in a
Dormouse,
whisper,
who seemed to be
half
talking in
afraid
his sleep,
that it would be
"that
offended again.
I breathe when I sleep is the same thing
"Mine is
as
a long
I sleep
and
when
a
I breathe."
sad tale," said the mouse.
"It
turning
is
to
the same
Alice
thing with you,"
and
said the
sighing.
Hatter. And here the
"It
conversation
is
dropped,
a long
and the
tale,
party sat
certainly,"
silent for a
said
minute,
Alice,
while Alice thought over
looking
all she
down
could
with
remember
wonder
about
at the
ravens
mouse's
and
tail.
writing desks. which wasn't much.
But why do you call it
The
sad?
Hatter was the first to break the
And
silence.
she kept on
"What day of the
puzzling
month
about
is it?" he said,
while the mouse was
turning to
speaking.
Alice.
So
He had
that
taken his
her
watch out of his
idea
pocket
the
and was
tale
looking at it
was
uneasily,
something like
shaking
this.
it every now and then, and holding
Here
it to
the
his
words
ear.
are written on the page.
Alice considered a little,
1,
and
2,
then said,
4 on a
"The
line,
fourth."
and the lines
2
are
days
offset,
wrong,
so they
sighed
snake
the
down
Hatter.
the page
"I told
in a
you butter
wavy
wouldn't suit the
fashion.
works," he
And
added,
here's what
looking
they said.
angrily at the March Hare.
Fury
"It was
said
the
to
best
a
butter,"
mouse
the March Hare
that
meekly
he met
replied.
in the house.
"Yes, but some crumbs
"Let
must
us
have got in
both
as well,"
go to
the
law.
Hatter grumbled. "You
I
shouldn't
will
have put it
prosecute
in with the
you.
bread knife."
Come,
The March
I'll
Hare
take
took
no
the watch
denial.
and looked at
We
it
must
gloomily.
have a trial.
Then he dipped it into his cup of
For
tea
really
and looked
this
at it
morning
again, but
I've
he could think of
to
nothing
do,"
better to say than his first remark.
said the mouse to
"It
the
was the
cur.
best butter, you know."
Such a trial, dear
Alice
sir,
had been looking over his shoulder with some
no
curiosity.
jury or judge
"What a funny
would be
watch,"
wasting
she
our
remarked.
breath.
"It tells the day of the month,
I'll
and
be
doesn't tell
judge,
what o'clock
I'll
it
be
is."
jury, said
"Why
cunning
should it?"
old Fury.
muttered the Hatter.
I'll
"Does your
try the
watch tell
whole
you what
cause
year it is?"
and
"Of
condemn
course
you
not,"
to death.
Alice replied, very readily.
And there's where
"But
you
that's
sneaky
because it
tip
stays
in.
the same year for such a long time
Continuing.
together."
You
which
are
is
not
just the case with
attending,"
mine,
said the mouse to
said the
Alice
Hatter.
severely. "What
Alice
are you
felt
thinking
dreadfully
of?"
puzzled. The Hatter's remark
beg your
seemed to have
pardon,"
no
said
sort of
Alice,
meaning in
very
it,
humbly.
and yet it was certainly English.
You had
"I
got
don't
to the
quite
fifth
understand you,"
bend,
she said,
I think.
as politely as she could.
I had not, cried the mouse.
"The Dormouse
sharply
is
and
asleep
very
again,"
angrily.
said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot
said
tea
Alice,
upon its nose.
always ready to make herself
The Dormouse
useful.
shook its head impatiently and said,
anxiously
without
about
opening
her,
its eyes,
"Oh,
"Of
do
course,
let
of course.
me help to
Just what I
undo
was
it."
going to remark myself."
"I shall do nothing of the
"Have
sort,"
you
said
guessed the
mouse,
riddle yet?"
getting
the
up
Hatter
and
said,
walking away.
turning to Alice again.
"You insult me by
"No,
talking such
I give it up,"
nonsense."
Alice replied. "What's the
"I
answer?"
didn't mean it," pleaded poor Alice.
"I haven't the slightest
"But
idea,"
you're so
said the
easily
Hatter.
offended, you know."
"Nor I," said the March Hare.
The mouse only growled
Alice
in
sighed
reply.
wearily. "I think you
"Please
might
come
do
back and
something
finish
better
your
with the time,"
story,"
she said,
Alice
"than
called
waste it
after
in asking riddles that have
and the
no
others all
answers."
joined in chorus.
"If you
"Yes,
knew
please
time
do."
as well as I do," said the Hatter,
But the mouse
"you
only
wouldn't talk
shook
about
its
wasting
head
it.
impatiently
It's
and
him."
walked a little quicker.
"I don't know what you mean,"
"What a pity
said
it wouldn't
Alice.
stay," sighed the Lory.
"Of course you
as
don't,"
soon as
the
as
Hatter
it was
said,
quite out of
tossing his
sight.
head
And
contemptuously.
an old crab
"I dare
took
say
the
you never even
opportunity
spoke to
of
time."
saying to her daughter,
"Perhaps
"Ah,
not,"
my dear,
Alice cautiously
let this be a
replied.
lesson to you,
"But I know I have to
never
beat
lose
time when I
your
learn
temper."
music." "Ah,
"Hold your
that
tongue,
accounts
Ma,"
for it,"
said the young crab
said the
a
Hatter.
little
"He won't
snappishly.
stand beating.
"You're
Now,
enough to
if
try
you
the
only kept on
patience of
good
an
terms
oyster."
with him, he'd do almost anything you liked
"Oh,
with the
I
clock.
wish I had
For
our
instance,
Dinah here.
suppose
I know
it were
I do,"
9 o'clock
said
in the
Alice
morning,
aloud,
just time to begin
addressing nobody
lessons.
in particular.
You'd only have to whisper a
She'd
hint
soon
to
catch
time,
it back.
and round goes the clock in a twinkling.
"And who is
1:30,
Dinah, if I
time
might
for dinner."
venture to ask the question?"
"I
said the
only wish
Lory.
it was," the March Hare
Alice
said to itself
replied
in a whisper.
eagerly, for she was
"That would be
always ready to
grand,
talk
certainly,"
about her
said
pet.
Alice thoughtfully.
"Dinah's
"But
our
then
cat,
I shouldn't be hungry
and
for
she's
it,
such
you know."
a capital one for catching
"Not at
mice,
first,
you
perhaps,"
can't think.
said the Hatter.
And,
"But
oh,
you
I
could
wish
keep
you
it
could
to
see
half
her
past
after
one
the
as long
birds.
as you liked."
Why, she'll eat a little
"Is
bird
that the way you
as
manage?"
soon as look at
Alice
it.
asked. The Hatter
This
shook his head
speech
mournfully.
caused a remarkable
"Not I,"
sensation
he replied.
among the party.
"We quarrelled last March,
Some of the birds
just before he
hurried
went
off at
mad, you
once.
know,"
One
pointing
old
with his
magpie
teaspoon at the
began
March
wrapping
Hare.
itself up
"It was
very
at the great
carefully,
concert given
remarking,
by the Queen of Hearts,
"I really
and
must
I had
be
to
getting
sing,
home.
Twinkle,
The night
twinkle,
air
little
doesn't
bat,
suit my
how I
throat."
wonder what you're
And the
at."
canary called out
You
in
know
a
the song,
trembling
perhaps?
voice to its children,
"I've heard something like it,"
"Come
said
away,
Alice.
my dears.
"It goes
It's
on, you
high
know,"
time
the
you
Hatter
were all
continued,
in bed."
"in this way.
On various pretenses,
Up above the
they
world
all
you
moved
fly,
off,
like a tea
and
tray
Alice
in the
was
sky.
soon left
Twinkle,
alone.
twinkle." Here the dormouse took itself and began singing in its sleep. Twinkle, 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 and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop.
I'm sure she's the best cat.
Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, "He's murdering the time! Off with his head!"
Began to cry again.
How dreadfully savage! Exclaimed Alice.
Low-spirited.
And ever since
In a
that,
little while,
the
however,
Hatter went on
she
in a
again
mournful
heard
tone,
a little
"He won't do a
pattering of
thing I
footsteps
ask.
in the distance,
It's always 6
and
o'clock
she looked
now."
up eagerly,
A bright idea
half
came into
hoping
Alice's head.
that the mouse had
"Is that
changed
the
his
reason
mind
so many tea
and
things
was
are put
coming
out here?"
back
she asked.
to finish his story.
"Yes, that's it," said the Hatter with a sigh.
This is the end.
"It's always tea time,
chapter
and we've no
3.
time to wash the things between whiles." "Then you keep moving round, I suppose," said Alice. "Exactly so," said the Hatter, "as the things get used up." "But what happens when you come to the beginning again?" Alice ventured to ask. "Suppose we change the subject," the March Hare interrupted, yawning. "I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story." "I'm afraid I don't know one," said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. "Then the Dormouse shall," they both cried. "Wake up, Dormouse!" And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. "I wasn't asleep," he said, in a hoarse, feeble voice. "I heard every word you fellows were saying." "Tell us a story," said the March Hare. "Yes, please do," pleaded Alice. "And be quick about it," added the Hatter, "or you'll be asleep again before it's done." "Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters," the Dormouse began in a great hurry, "and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well." "What did they live on?" said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. "They lived on treacle," said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. "They couldn't have done that, you know," Alice gently remarked. "They'd have been ill."
"Why, Marianne, what are you doing
"So
out
they
here?
were,"
Run
said the
out this
Dormouse.
minute and fetch me a
"Very
pair of
ill."
gloves and a fan. Quick now!"
Alice tried to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on,
The mistake it had made.
"But why did they live at the bottom of a well?"
He took me for
"Take
his
some more
housemaid,"
tea,"
she
the
said
March
to
Hare
herself
said to
as she
Alice
ran.
very earnestly.
"How surprised he'll be when he
"I've
finds
had
out
nothing
I am.
yet,"
But I'd
Alice
better take
replied
him his
in an
fan and
offended
gloves.
tone.
That is, if
"So
I
I
can
can't
find
take
them."
more." "You mean you can't take less," said the Hatter. "It's very easy to take more than nothing."
Brass plate with the name
"Nobody asked
W.
your opinion,"
Rabbit
said Alice.
engraved upon it.
"Who's making personal
She went
remarks
in without
now?"
knocking, and
the Hatter
hurried
asked
upstairs
triumphantly.
in great fear lest she should
Alice
meet the
did
real
not quite know
Marianne
what to
and
say
be
to this,
turned
so
out
she
of
helped
the house
herself to
before
some
she had
tea
found the
and
fan
bread and butter,
gloves.
and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question.
It seems, Alice
Why
said
did they
herself,
live at the
to
bottom
be
of a well?
Going messages for a rabbit.
The Dormouse again
I suppose
took a minute
Diana
or
will
two
be
to
sending
think
me
about
out
it,
on
and
messages
then said,
next.
"It was a treacle
And she
well.
began fancying the sort of
There's
thing
no
that
such
would happen.
thing."
Miss
Alice was
Alice,
beginning
come here
very
directly and
angrily,
get ready for your
but the
walk.
Hatter and the March Hare went,
Coming in a
"Shh,
minute,
shh,"
nurse, but I've got to
and
see
the
that the mouse
Dormouse
doesn't get
sulkily
out.
remarked, "If you
Only
can't
I
be
didn't
civil,
think,"
you'd better
Alice
finish
went
the
on,
story for
"that they'd
yourself."
let Dinah stop in the house if
"No,
they began
please go
ordering people
on,"
about like that.
Alice said very humbly. "I won't
By
interrupt
this
again.
time, she
I
had
dare
found
say
her
there
way
may be
into
one."
the tidy little room with a table
"One
in the
indeed,"
window,
said the Dormouse
and on it,
indignantly.
as she
However,
had
he
put
consented to go
a
on.
fan and 2 or 3
"And
pairs of
so
fine
these 3
white
little
kid
sisters,
gloves.
they were learning to draw,
She took
you
up
know."
the fan and a pair of the gloves,
"What did they
and
draw?"
was just
said
going to
Alice,
leave the room,
quite forgetting
when
her
eyes
promise.
fell upon a little bottle that
"Treacle,"
stood
said
near
the
looking
Dormouse,
glass.
without considering at
There was
all
no
this time.
label this time with the words,
"I want a
"Drink
clean
me."
cup," interrupted the Hatter.
Nevertheless, she
"Let's all move
uncorked
one
it
place
and put
on."
it to her lips.
He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter. "So I should think you could draw treacle out of a treacle well, eh, stupid?" "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark. "Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well in." This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it. "They were learning to draw," the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy. "And they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M." "Why with an M?" said Alice. "Why not?" said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time, and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek, and went on. "That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know you say things are much of a muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of a muchness?" "Really, now you ask me," said Alice, very much confused. "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. "At any rate, I'll never go there again," said Alice, as she picked her way through the wood. "It's the stupidest tea-party I ever was at in all my life." Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. "That's very curious," she thought, "but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once." And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall, and close to the little glass table. "Now I'll manage better this time," she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket, till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. End of Chapter 7. Recorded on November 11th, 2005, in Oceanside, California.
As the door opened inwards, and Alice's elbow was pressed hard against it.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them, and just as she came up to them she heard one of them say, "Look out now, Five! Don't go splashing paint all over me like that!" "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. "Seven jogged my elbow." On which Seven looked up and said, "That's right, Five, always lay the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, too," said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush, and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why are you painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to—" At this moment 5, who'd been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" and the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers, carrying clubs. They were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the white rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the knave of hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion, and last of all this grand procession came the king and queen of hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people all had to lie down upon their faces so they couldn't see it? So she stood still where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the knave of hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree, for you see, as they were all lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were her gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense!" said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm, and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him, and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so very carefully, with one foot. "Get up," said the Queen, in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that," screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said 2 in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2 looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent, and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. "It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Shh," said the Rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'what a pity'?" the Rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'what for?'" "She boxed the Queen's ears," the Rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush!" the Rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places!" shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or two, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and to stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she got its neck nicely straightened out, and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself round and look up in her face, with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing. And when she got its head down, and she was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs. And in a very short time the Queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head! Off with her head!" about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute, and then, thought she, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape, and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded. "It's no use speaking to it," she thought, "till its ears have come, or at least one of them." In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo, and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began, in rather a complaining tone, "and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground. And I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the Queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then she noticed that the Queen was close behind her, listening, so she went on, "Likely to win, that it's hardly worth while finishing the game." The Queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the King, going up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the King. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Don't be impertinent," said the King, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the King very decidedly, and he called the Queen, who was passing at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed."
round hair.
The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking round. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," said the King eagerly, and he hurried off.
There was a large
Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the Queen's voice in the distance screaming with passion. She'd already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both the hedgehogs were out of sight. But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice, as all the arches are gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked it away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the King, and the Queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable.
This is a LibriVox recording.
The moment Alice appeared,
LibriVox
she was appealed
recordings
to
are
by
in the
all
public
three
domain.
to settle the question,
For more
and they
information
repeated their
or to
arguments to her,
volunteer,
though, as
please
they all
visit
spoke at once, she found it very
LibriVox.org.
hard indeed to make out exactly what they
This
said.
recording by
The
Mark
executioner's
Bradford.
argument was, you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a
Alice's
body to
Adventures
cut
in
it off
Wonderland
from. That he
by
had
Lewis
never
Carroll.
had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't
Chapter
going to
5.
begin at his time of life.
Advice from a
The
caterpillar.
King's argument was that anything that had a
The
head could be
caterpillar and
beheaded,
Alice
and that
looked
you
at
weren't
each
to
other
talk
for some
nonsense.
time in silence.
The Queen's argument was
At last,
that
the
if something
caterpillar
wasn't
took the
done about it
hookah
in
out of
less
its
than no
mouth
time, she'd
and
have
addressed her
everybody
in a
executed
languid,
all
sleepy
around.
voice.
It was this last remark that
Who
had
are
made the whole
you?
party look so
said
grave
the
and
caterpillar.
anxious. Alice
This
could think
was
of
not
nothing
an
else to
encouraging
say,
opening
but
for a conversation.
it belongs to the Duchess. You better
Alice
ask her
replied,
about it.
rather shyly,
She's in prison, the
I-
Queen said to
I
the
hardly know,
executioner.
sir, just at
Fetch her
present.
here.
At least,
And the executioner
I know
went
who
off
I
like an
was
arrow.
when I got up this
The
morning.
cat's head began
but I think
fading
I must
away
have
the
been
moment he
changed
was
several
gone, and by the
times
time
since
he had
then.
come back with the Duchess, it had
What do
entirely
you mean
disappeared.
by that?
So the
said
King and the
caterpillar
executioner
sternly.
ran wildly
Explain
up and
yourself.
down looking for it, while the rest of the party
I can't
went back to
explain
the game.
myself, I'm afraid, sir, said Alice.
End of chapter 8.
Because I'm not myself, you
Read by
see.
Kristen McQuillan, Tokyo,
I don't
Japan,
see, said the
December
caterpillar.
15th, 2005.
I'm afraid I can't put it more clearly, Alice
This
replied
is a
very
LibriVox
politely,
recording.
for I can't
All
understand it
LibriVox
myself to begin
recordings
with.
are in the
And being
public
so many
domain.
different sizes in a day
For more
is very
information
confusing.
or to volunteer,
It
please
isn't,
visit
said the caterpillar.
www.librivox.org.
Well, perhaps you haven't found it so yet, said Alice. But when you
Alice's
have to turn
Adventures
into a
in
chrysalis,
Wonderland
you will
by
someday,
Lewis
you know.
Carroll.
And then after that into a
Chapter
butterfly.
9,
I should
The
think
Mock
you'll feel it a
Turtle
little
Story.
queer, won't you?
You
Not a
can't
bit,
think how
said the
glad
caterpillar.
I am
This
to
is a
see you
LibriVox
again,
recording.
Well,
dear old
perhaps
lady.
your feelings may be
Recordings are in
different,
said the
public
said
Duchess,
Alice.
For
as
more
she
information
All I
tied
know
her
is
arms
it would feel
affectionately
very
into
weird to
Alice's,
visit
me.
and they walked
LibriVox.org.
off together.
You, said
This
the
reading
caterpillar
by Ron
contemptuously.
Alice
Shaw.
was very glad to
Who
find
are
her
you?
in such a
Adventures in
pleasant
Wonderland
temper,
by
and
Which
thought
brought
to
them back
herself
again
that
to the
perhaps
beginning
it
of the
was only
conversation.
temper that had made her so
Alice
savage
felt a
when
little
they
For a
were in
minute
the
or two,
kitchen.
she stood looking at the house
When
and
I'm
wondering
the
what to do
Duchess,
next, when suddenly
And she
a
drew
footman
herself
in
up
livery
and
came
said,
running
not
out
in a
of the
very
very
room.
gravely,
She considered him a
I
footman
think
because he was
you ought to
invisible.
tell me who you
Otherwise,
are
judging by his
first.
face only, she would have called him a fish.
Why?
Soup
And rapped
does
loudly
very
at the
well
door with his
without
knuckles. It was
Here was
opened by
another
another
puzzling
footman in
question.
livery with a round
And as
face
Alice
and
could
large
not
eyes
think
like
of
a
any
frog.
good reason,
And both
and as the
footmen
caterpillar
held
seemed
arms
to be
and
in a
powdered
very
hair
unpleasant
and
state
curls
of
all over
mind,
their head.
she turned away.
She felt very
and
curious to
vinegar
know
that
what it was
makes
all
them
about.
Come
sour,
back,
Crept a little
the
way
caterpillar
and chamomile
called
that
after
makes
her.
them bitter.
The
I have
first
something
footman began
important
by
to say.
producing from
And
under his
such
arm
things
a
that
great
make
letter
children
This
nearly
sounded
as large as
promising,
himself,
certainly.
I only
and
wish
this he
Alice
handed over
turned
to
and
the
came
others,
back
saying
Then
in
they
a
wouldn't
solemn
be so
tone for the
stingy
Duchess
about it,
an
you know.
invitation
Keep your
from the
temper,
Queen to play
said the
She had
croquet.
caterpillar.
quite forgotten
The
the
frog
Duchess
footman
by this
repeated
time.
in the
Is that
same
all?
solemn tone,
said
slowly
Alice,
changing the
swallowing
order of the
down her
words a
anger
little.
as well as
Closer
her
From the
her
Queen,
ear.
an invitation for the
You're
Duchess to
No,
play
thinking about
croquet.
said the
something, my
caterpillar.
dear.
Then they both
And that
bowed,
makes
and
you
their
forget
curls
to
got
talk.
entangled together.
I
Alice
can't
thought
tell
she
you
might
what
as
Alice
well
laughed
wait,
so much at
as
this
she had
that
nothing
she
else
had to
to
run
do.
back into the wood
And
for
perhaps,
fear of
after
their
all,
hearing
it might
her.
tell her something
Perhaps
And
worth
when she
hearing.
next peeped out, the
For
first
some
footman was
minutes
gone,
it
and
puffed
the other
away
was
without
sitting on the
speaking.
ground near the door,
But at
staring
last it
stupidly up
unfolded
into
its
the
arms,
sky.
Everything's
took the
got a
hookah
moral.
out
Alice
of its
went
mouth
timidly up to
again,
the door
and
and
said,
knocked.
And she
There's
was
no
"What are you
sort no
feel
use in
chained
knocking,
to you.
said the footman, and that's for two reasons.
I'm afraid I am,
First,
sir,
because I am on
said
the same
Alice.
side of the door as
I
you.
can't remember
Secondly,
things as I
because
used
they're
to,
making such
and I
a
don't
noise
keep the
inside
same
that no one
size
could
for 10
possibly hear
minutes
you.
together.
And certainly there was a most extraordinary
Can't
noise
remember
going on
what
within.
things, said the
Constant
cashier.
howling and sneezing, and every now
Well,
and then a great
I've tried to
crash as
say,
if a dish
how doth
or
the
a
little
kettle
busy
was
bee?
broken to
But it all
pieces.
came different,
Please
Alice
then, said
replied
Alice,
in a very
how am I to get
melancholy
in?
voice.
There might be some sense in your knocking.
Repeat Your
thing went
old
on
Father
without
William,
attending to her.
said the caterpillar.
If we had a door between us, for
Alice
instance, if
folded
you
her
were
hands
inside,
and
you might
began.
knock and I could let you out,
You are old, Father
He
William,
was looking
the
up at
young
the
man
sky
said,
all the time.
and your hair has become
and
very
this
white.
Alice thought decided to
And
be
yet you
civil.
incessantly
But
stand on
perhaps
your
I
head.
can't help it,
Do you
she said to
think, at
herself.
your age,
His
it is
eyes
right?
are so very nearly at the top
In my
of his
youth,
head.
Father William
But at any
replied
rate,
to
he
his
might
son,
answer questions.
I feared it might injure the brain.
How am I to get in?
But now
She
that I'm
repeated
perfectly
aloud.
sure I have none,
I
why
shall
I
sit
do it
here,
again and
the footman
again.
remarked, till tomorrow.
You are old, said the youth,
At this
as I
moment, the
mentioned
door of the house
before,
opened,
and
a
have
large
grown
plate
most
was
uncommonly
skimming
fat.
up straight for the footman's
You
head.
turned a back somersault
It
in
just
at the
grazed
door.
his nose
Pray,
and broke
what is
to
the
pieces
reason
against
of
one of
that?
the trees behind him.
In my
Or
youth,
next
said
day,
the sage,
maybe.
as he shook
The
his grey
footman
locks,
continued
I
in the
kept
same
all my
tone,
limbs very
exactly
supple
as nothing
by the
happened.
use of this ointment. 1
How
shilling
am I
a
to
box.
get in?
Allow me to
asked
sell you a
Alice
couple?
in a louder tone.
Are
You
You
to
are
get in
old,
at all?
said the youth,
said the
and your
footman.
jaws are
That's
tough.
the first
Anything
question, you
tougher
know.
than suet.
It was
You
no doubt
finished the
only
goose
Alice
with the
felt
bones
like
in the
being
beak.
told so.
Pray, how
It's
did you
really
manage
dreadful,
it?
she muttered to herself. The way
In
all
my
these
youth,
creatures
said his
argue,
father,
it's
I took
enough
to
to
the
drive
law
one
and
crazy.
argued each case with
The
my
footman
wife,
seemed to think
and
this
the
a good
muscular
opportunity
strength
for
which it
repeating
gave to my
his
jaw
remark
has
with
lasted
very
the rest of my life.
I shall sit here, he said.
You are old,
On and
said the
off for
youth.
days
One
and
would hardly
days.
suppose
But what am I
that
to
your eye
do?
was as steady as ever.
Anything you like.
Yet you
said the
balanced an
footman,
eel
and
on the
began
end of
to
your
use-
nose.
Well,
What
there's
made you
no
so
use in
awfully
talking to
clever?
him, said Alice desperately.
I have
He's
answered 3
perfectly
questions,
idiotic.
and that is enough.
And then
said
opened
his
the door
father.
and
Don't
went
give
in.
yourself airs.
The door
Do
led
you
right
think I
into
can
a
listen
large
all day to
kitchen
such
which was
stuff?
full of
Be
smoke
off,
from
or I'll
one
kick you
end to the other.
downstairs.
The Duchess was sitting on a 3-legged stool in the
That
middle
is
of
not
nursing
said
a
right,
baby.
said
The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron
Not
which
quite
seemed
right,
to be
I'm
full of
afraid,
soup.
said Alice.
There's certainly too much pepper in
Some
that
of the
soup,
words have
Alice
got
said to
to
herself as well as she could, sneezing.
It is wrong
There
from
certainly
beginning
was
to
too much of
end,
it in the air.
said the caterpillar.
Even the Duchess sneezed
doesn't
occasionally,
look
as
like
for the
one,
baby,
but
it
it
was
is.
sneezing and howling alternately without a moment's
The caterpillar
pause.
was the first.
The only 2 creatures in the kitchen that
And the
did
moral
not
of
sneeze
What
were the
size
cook
do
and
you
the
want
large
to
cat
be?
which
What
was
you
laying on
seem
the
to
hearth
be.
and grinning from ear to
Or,
ear.
if
Oh,
you'd
I'm
like
not
it, put
particular
more
as to
Would
sense
you
size,
tell me,
Alice
said
Never
Alice a
imagine
little
yourself
timidly, for
not to
she
be
was
Only
not
one
quite
doesn't
sure
like
whether
changing
it
so
would
often,
matter for
you
her
know.
to speak first.
what you
Why,
were
your
or
cat
don't
might have
know,
been
said the
was not
caterpillar.
otherwise
It's a
than what you
Cheshire
had
cat,
been would
said the
Alice
Duchess,
said
appear to
nothing.
and
them
that's
to be
why,
otherwise.
She had
pig.
never been so
She
much
said the last
contradicted
word
in her
with
life
such
before,
sudden violence
and she
that
felt that
Alice
she was
quite
losing
jumped, but she
understand
saw in
that
another
better.
moment that it was
Alice
addressed to
Are
the
you
baby,
content
and not to her.
now? Said the
So she
caterpillar.
took
had it
courage and went on
written
again.
down.
Well,
I
I
didn't
should
know
like
that
to be a little
cats
larger,
always
sir,
grinned.
if you
In
wouldn't
fact,
mind.
I didn't know that cats could grin.
3 inches
They
is
all
such a
can,
wretched height
said
to
the
be.
Duchess, and most of them do.
It is a
I
very
don't
good
know
height
anything,
indeed,
don't
said
trouble
Alice very
yourself to
politely,
say it any
and
longer
quite
than
really
that.
had
Himself
gotten into a
upright, said
conversation.
Brooks. It
You
was
don't know
that
much,
trouble.
said the
Ah.
Duchess, and that's a fact.
But I'm not used to
Alice
it,
did not
said
like
Alice
all the
in
tone
a
of this
piteous
remark and
tone.
thought it would be as
And
well
she
to
thought to
introduce
herself,
some other subject of
I wish the
conversation.
creatures wouldn't be so
While she was
easily
trying to
offended.
fix on one, the
But
cook
she
took the
did not.
cauldron of
You'll
soup
get
from the
used to
fire
it in
and at once
time,
set
said
to
the
work
caterpillar.
throwing everything
And
within
it put
her
the
reach
hookah into
at
its
the
mouth
Duchess
and
and
began
baby.
smoking again.
The fire irons came first,
This
then
time,
followed a
Alice
shower
waited
of
patiently
saucepans,
until it
plates, and
chose
dishes.
to speak
The
again.
Duchess took no notice of them
In a minute
even
or
when they
two,
hit her.
the
The
caterpillar
baby was
took the
howling
hookah
so
out of
much
its
already
mouth
that it was
and
quite
yawned
impossible
once
to
or
say whether
twice
the blow
and shook
hurt at
itself.
her.
And the moral
Then it
Oh,
got down
please
off
mind
the
what you're
chair
doing,
and crawled
cried
away in
Alice,
the grass,
jumping up and down
merely
and
remarking
tapping
as
at
it
her.
went.
Oh, there goes his
One
precious
side will make
nose!
you grow
As
taller,
an
and
unusually
the other
large
side will
saucepan
make you
flew
grow
by
shorter.
her and very nearly carried it off. If
One side
everybody
of
minded their
the
own
other side of
business,
what?
said the
Replied
Duchess in
Alice.
a hoarse growl, the world would go around a deal
Of the
faster
mushroom,
than it does.
said the caterpillar,
Which would
just
not
as
be
if
an
she had
advantage,
asked it
said
aloud.
Alice, who felt very glad
And
to
in
get an
another moment,
opportunity
it was
of showing off a little of her knowledge. Just think of what work it
Alice
would make
remained
for the day
looking
and night.
thoughtfully at the mushroom
You see, the
for a
Earth
minute,
takes
trying to
24
make out
hours to
which
turn
way
around on
side
its
it
axis.
was. And
Talking
as
of
it flipped
axes,
around,
said the Duchess. Chop off her head.
And that's
Alice
about
glanced
half
However,
rather anxiously
at
the
last
cook
she
as
stretched
he
her
tried
arms
to
round
take
it
the hint,
as far
but
as
the
they
cook
would
was
go,
busily
and
stirring
broke off
the
a
soup
bit
and
as he
seemed
tried
not
to
to be
give her
listening.
each hand.
She went on again.
with the game.
24 hours.
And now,
I
which is
think,
which?
quarter to
She
12.
said to herself.
Oh, don't
much
bother
nibbled a
me,
little
said
at
the
the right
Duchess.
hand.
I never could
Followed
abide
her
figures.
back to the
And with
croquet
this,
The
she
next
began
moment she
nursing the
felt a
child
violent
again,
blow
singing a
underneath her
sort of
chin.
lullaby to it as she
It had
did
struck
so,
her foot.
and giving a violent shake at the end of
She was a
every
good
line.
deal frightened by this very sudden
Roughly,
change,
dear little boy,
but she felt that there was no
indeed,
time
when
to be
he
lost,
seems
as she was shrinking
He
rapidly.
only does it to
So she set to
annoy
work at
because
once to
he
eat
knows
some of the
it
other bit.
teases.
All the time they were
Her
And
chin
then the
was
chorus
pressed so
never
closely
left
against
off
her
the
throat
baby joined.
that there was hardly
Wow,
room to open her
wow,
mouth.
wow.
Off with his
But she
head.
did it
While the
at
Duchess
last,
sang the
Off
second
with
managed
her
to
head.
swallow a
kept
morsel
tossing the
of the
baby
violence.
violently up and down,
sentenced
and
were
the poor
taken
little
into
thing
custody
howled
by the
so that
soldiers.
Alice could
Come,
hardly
my
get
head's
a
free
word.
at last,
Had to
said
leave
Alice
off
in a
the
tone of
arches
delight,
to do this,
which
so that
changed
by
into
the end
alarm
of
in
half
another
an hour or
moment,
so, there were
when
no
she found
arches
that her
left.
shoulders were
Enjoy
nowhere to
the
be
pepper
found.
when he pleases.
All she could see when she
Wow,
looked
wow,
down
wow. now.
was an immense
Here,
leaf
you
of
might
net,
nurse it a bit if you
which
like,
seemed to
the
rise
Duchess
like a
said to
stalk
Alice, flinging
out of
the
a sea
baby
of
at her
green
as she
leaves
spoke.
that lay
I
far
must
below.
go and get ready to play croquet with the queen.
What can all that
Hurried out
green
the room,
stuff
and the
be?
cook threw a
said
frying
Alice.
pan after her.
And
She
where
ran
have
to
my
just
shoulders
as
got
her.
to? And
Alice
oh,
caught
my
the baby
poor
with some
hands, how
difficulty,
is it
as
I
it was
can't
a
see
queer-shaped
these?
little creature, and
She was
held up
moving
its
them
arms
about
and legs
as
in
she
all
spoke,
directions.
but no result
Just like a
seemed to follow,
starfish, thought
except a
Alice.
little shaking
The
of
poor
the
little
big
thing was
green
snorting like a
leaves.
steam engine when
he
she
shall
caught
tell
it,
you his
and
history.
kept
As there
doubling
seemed
itself
to
up
be
and
no
throwing
chance of
itself
getting her
out again,
hands
so
up
that
to
all
her
together
head,
for the first
she
minute
tried
or
to get
two,
her head
it was as
onto
much as
them,
she could do to
You
hold
and
it.
was delighted to
As
find
As soon
that
as
her
she had
neck
made
would
out
bend
the
about
proper way of
easily in
nursing
any
it,
direction,
which was to
like a
twist it up in
serpent.
a sort of knot, and then
She
keep
had
tight
just
hold of its
succeeded
rear
in
end
curving it
and
down
left foot,
into a
so
graceful
as to prevent
zigzag,
its undoing
and was
itself.
going to dive
She
in
carried
among
it
the
into the
leaves,
open air.
which she found to be
If I
nothing
don't
but the
take this
tops
child
of the
away from
trees
you,
under
thought
which
Alice,
she had
they're
been
sure to kill
wandering,
it in a day or
when a
two.
sharp hiss
Wouldn't
made
it
her
be
draw
nice to
back
leave
in a
it
hurry.
behind? She
A
said the
large
last words
pigeon
out
had
loud,
flown
and
into
the
her
thing
face
grunted
and
in
was beating her
reply.
violently
It had left off
with its
sneezing
wings.
by this time.
Don't
grunt,
Serpent!
said Alice.
Screamed the
That's
pigeon.
not at all a proper way of
I'm not a
expressing
serpent,
yourself.
said
The
Alice
baby
indignantly.
grunted again, and
Let
Alice
me
looked
alone.
very anxiously into its face to
Serpent,
see
I
what was
say
the matter
again,
with it.
repeated the pigeon,
There could be no
but in a
doubt
more
that it had a
subdued
very
tone,
turn-up
and
nose,
added
which
with a
was
kind
more
of
like a
sob,
snout than
I've
a
tried
real
every
nose.
way, and
Also, its
nothing
eyes were
seems to
getting
suit them.
extremely small for a baby.
I
Altogether, Alice
haven't the
did not
least
like the
idea
look
what
of
you're
the thing
talking
at all.
about, said Alice.
But perhaps it's only
I've tried the
sobbing,
roots
she
of
thought,
trees,
and looked
and
into
I've
its
tried
eyes
banks,
again
and
to
I've
see if
tried
there were any
hedges,
tears.
the pigeon went on.
No,
without
there were
attending
no
to her.
tears.
But those
If you're going
serpents,
to turn
there's
into
no
a pig, my
pleasing
dear,
them.
said Alice seriously, I've got nothing more to
Alice
do
was
with you.
more
Mine
and
now.
more puzzled.
The poor little thing
But
sobbed
she
again
thought there
or
was no
grunted.
use in
It was
saying
impossible
anything
to say
more.
which, and then went on for
Everybody
some
had
while in
finished.
silence.
As if
Alice
it
was
wasn't
just
trouble
beginning to
enough
think to
hatching
herself,
the
now,
eggs,
what am I
said the
supposed to
pigeon.
do with this
But I
creature
must
when
be
I get
on the
home?
lookout for
When it
serpents
grunted
night
again
and
so
day.
violently
Why,
that she
I
looked
haven't had
down
a
into
wink
its
of
face
sleep
with some
these 3
alarm.
weeks.
This time there could be no
I'm very
mistake
sorry
about
you've been
it. It was
annoyed,
neither
said
more or
Alice,
less
who
than a
was
pig.
beginning to see its meaning.
And she felt that it would be quite
And just
absurd
as
for her
I'd
to
taken
carry
the
it any
highest
further.
tree in
So
the
she let the
wood,
little creature
continued the
down
pigeon,
and felt quite
raising its
relieved to
voice
see
to
it
a
trot
shriek.
away quietly.
And just as I
into
was
it.
thinking I should be
If it
free
had
of them
grown
at
up, she
last,
said to
they
herself,
must
it
needs
would have
come
made a
wriggling down
dreadfully
from the
ugly child.
sky.
But it
Ugh,
makes a rather
serpent!
handsome pig, I think. And she
But I'm
began
not a
thinking of
serpent,
her
I
other
tell you,
children she
said
knew
Alice.
who might do very
I'm
well
a-
as pigs,
I'm a...
and was just saying to herself,
Well,
if
what
one
are
only
you,
knew
said
the
the
right
pigeon.
way to change them.
I can see you're
When she
trying
was
to
a little
invent
startled
something.
by seeing the Cheshire cat sitting on the bow of
I'm a
tree
little
just a
girl,
few
said
yards
Alice,
off.
rather
The
doubtfully,
cat only
as she
grinned
remembered
when it
the
saw
number of
Alice,
changes she
and
had
it
gone
looked
through that day.
good-natured, she thought. Still, it had
A
very
likely
long claws
story
and a great
indeed,
teeth,
said the
so
pigeon,
she
in a
felt
tone
that it
of
ought to be
deepest
treated with
contempt.
respect.
I've seen a good many
Cheshire
little
Cat
girls in my
began
time,
rather
but never
timidly,
one with
saying
such a
she
neck
did
as
not
that.
at all know
No,
whether
no,
it would like
you're a
it.
serpent, and
However,
there's no
it
use
only
denying
grew a
it.
little wider.
I suppose you'll be
Come,
telling me
it's
next
pleased
that
so
you have
far,
never
thought
tasted
Alice,
an egg.
and she went on.
Once,
Would you tell
I
me,
have
please,
tasted eggs,
which way I
certainly,
ought to
said
go from
Alice,
here?
who was a very
I was
truthful
a
child.
real
That depends
But little
a
girls
good
eat
deal
eggs,
on
like as
where
much as
you want
serpents
to
do,
go,
you know?
said the cat. I don't much care
I
where
don't
it goes,
believe it,
Alice.
said the pigeon.
Then it doesn't
But if they
matter
do,
which way
why
you
then they're a
go,
kind of serpent,
said
that's
the
all
cat.
I can say.
So as long as I go somewhere,
This
Alice
was such a
added
new
with
idea
expectation.
to Alice
Oh,
that she
you're
was
sure
quite
to
silent
do
for a
that,
minute or two,
said the cat.
which gave the
If
pigeon
only
the
you
opportunity
walk
of adding,
long enough.
"You're looking for
Alice felt
eggs,
this
I
could
know
not
that
be
well
denied,
enough.
so she
And what
tried
does it
another
matter to
question.
me whether you're a
What sort
little
of
girl
people
or a
live about
serpent?
here?
when we
In
were
that
It matters a good
direction,
deal to
the
me,
cat
said
said,
Alice
waving its right
hastily.
paw around.
But I'm not looking
Lives
for
a
eggs, as it
hatter,
happens.
and in
And if
that
I was, I
direction,
shouldn't want
waving
yours.
the other paw,
I don't like them
lives
raw.
a March
Master
hare.
was an old
Well,
Visit either
be off
you
then,
like,
said
they're
the
both
pigeon in a
mad.
sulky
But I
tone,
don't want
as
to
it
go
settled
among
down
my people
again
house
into its
remarks.
nest.
if he wasn't one.
Oh, you can't
Alice
tell us
crouched
that,
down
said
among
the
the
cat.
trees.
We're
called
all
him
mad
Tortoise
here.
because
I'm
he's
mad.
water.
You're
Getting
mad.
entangled among
How
the
do you know
branches.
I'm mad?
And every
said
now and
Alice.
then she had to stop
You
and
must
undo
be,
it.
said the cat, or you
After
wouldn't
a
have come
while,
here.
she remembered that
Alice
she
didn't
still
think
held the
that
pieces
proved
of
it at
mushroom
all.
in her
However,
hand.
she went on.
And she set to
And how do
work
you know
very
that you're
carefully,
mad? To
nibbling first
begin
at
with,
one
said
and
the
then at
cat,
the other,
a dog's
and growing
not
sometimes
mad.
taller
You grant
and sometimes
that?
shorter,
I suppose
until
so,
she had
said Alice.
succeeded in bringing herself
Well
down
then,
to her
the
usual
cat went
height.
on. You see, a dog growls when
It was
it's
so
angry
long
and
since she
wags
had been
its
anything
tail
near
when
the
it's
right
pleased.
size,
Now,
that it felt
I
quite
growl
strange
when
at
I'm
first.
pleased
But she got
and
used
wag
to it
my
in a few
tail when I'm
minutes
angry.
and began talking to
Therefore,
herself
I'm
as
mad.
usual.
I call it
Come,
purring, not
there's half my
growling,
plan
said
done
Alice.
now.
Call
How
it what
puzzling
you
all
like,
these changes
said the
are.
cat.
I'm
Do
never
you
sure
play
what I'm going
croquet
to
with the
be from
queen
one
today?
minute to another.
I should
However,
like it very much,
I've got
said
back to my
Alice,
right
but I
size.
haven't been invited
The next
yet.
thing is to
fact,
get
See
into
me
that
there,
beautiful garden.
said the
How
cat,
is that
and
to be done,
vanished.
I wonder?
Alice was not much surprised at
As she
this.
said
She was
this,
getting so
she
well
came
used
suddenly
to
upon an
birds and
open
habits.
place with a little house
While
in
she
it
was
about
still
4
looking at
feet
the place
high.
where it had been, it suddenly appeared again.
Whoever lives there,
By
thought Alice,
by,
it'll never
what
do to come
became
upon
of
them
baby,
this size.
said the cat.
Why, I
I've
should frighten them
nearly
out of their
forgotten to
wits.
ask. It
said the
turned
Mock
So
into
she
a
Turtle.
began nibbling at the
Alice
right-hand bit
answered
again,
very
said
quietly,
and did not venture
just
to
as
go
if
near
cat
the
had come
house
back in the
till she had
usual
brought
way.
herself
Then
down
yours
to
wasn't
9
I thought it
inches
would,
high.
said the cat,
said
and
the
vanished
Mock
again.
Turtle in a tone
End
of
Alice
great
waited a
of chapter
little,
5.
half
Now
expecting
at
to see her
ours,
again, but it did
Recorded
not
had
appear.
December
at the end of the
28th,
After a
bill,
minute or two,
2005,
she
French,
walked on in the
Longmont,
direction in which the
Colorado.
March Hare
and
was said to live.
washing.
I've seen hatters
Extra.
before, she said to herself.
You couldn't have
The March
wanted
Hare
it
will be
much,
much more
said
interesting,
Alice,
and
living at the
perhaps,
bottom of the sea.
as this is May, it won't
I
be
couldn't
raving mad,
afford to
at
learn
least
it,
not so mad
said
as
the
it
Mock
was
Turtle
in
with a
March.
sigh.
As she said this,
I
she
only
looked up,
took
and there
the
was the cat
regular
again,
course.
sitting on the branch of a tree.
What was that? Inquired Alice.
Did you say pig or
Reeling
fig?
and writhing,
said the
of
cat.
course,
I
to
said
begin
pig,
with,
replied
the
Alice,
Mock Turtle
and I wish
replied.
that you wouldn't keep
And
appearing
then the
and
different
vanishing
branches
so
of
suddenly.
arithmetic,
You make one quite
ambition,
giddy.
Distraction,
All right, said the
uglification,
cat, and this time it vanished
derision.
quite slowly,
I
beginning with the
never
end of
heard
the
of
tail and ending with the
uglification,
grin, which remained
Alice
some
ventured to
time
say.
after the rest of it had gone.
What is it?
Well,
The Griffin
I've
lifted
often
up
seen a
both
cat
its
without
paws
a
in
grin,
surprise.
thought Alice.
What?
But a grin without
Never
a
heard
cat?
of
It's the
uglifying?
most curious thing
It
I ever
exclaimed.
saw in all my life.
You know what to beautify
She had
is,
not
I
gone
suppose.
much further before she came in sight of the
Yes,
house of the
said
March
Alice
Hare.
doubtfully.
She thought it
It
must be the right
means
house because the
to
chimneys
make
were shaped like ears and the roof was thatched
prettier.
with fur.
Well, then,
It was such a
the
large
Griffin
house
went on,
that she did
if you
not
don't
like to
know
go
what
nearer till she had
uglify is,
nibbled
you
some
are
more
a
of the
simpleton.
left-hand bit of mushroom, and
Alice
she
did
raised
not
herself
feel
about 2
encouraged
feet
to
high.
ask any more questions
Even then
about
she
it.
walked up
So
towards
she
it
turned to
rather
the Mock
timidly,
Turtle
saying
and
to
said,
herself,
"What else
suppose
had
it
you
should
to
be
learn?"
raving mad after all.
Well, there
I
was
almost wish I'd
mystery,
gone to the Hatter
Mock Turtle
instead.
replied, counting
End of
off the
chapter
subjects
6.
on his flappers. Mystery, ancient and modern, with seaography. Then drawling. The drawling master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils. What was that like? Said Alice. Well, I can't show it you myself, the Mock Turtle said. I'm too stiff, and the Griffin never learnt it. Hadn't time, said the Griffin. I went to the classics master, though. He was an old crab, he was. I never went to him, the Mock Turtle said with a sigh. He taught laughing and grief, they used to say. So he did, said the Griffin, sighing in his turn, and both creatures hid their faces in their paws. And how many hours a day did you do lessons? Said Alice in a hurry to change the subject. 10 hours the first day, said the Mock Turtle, 9 the next, and so on. What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice. That's the reason they are called lessons, the Griffin remarked, because they lesson from day to day. This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. Then, the 11th day must have been a holiday. Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle. And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on eagerly. That's enough about lessons, the Griffin interrupted in a very decided tone. Tell her something about the games now. End of chapter 9.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger W. Barnett. Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flapper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice. "Same as if he had a bone in his throat," said the Griffin, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and, with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again. "You may not have lived much under the sea." "I haven't," said Alice. "And perhaps you were never even introduced to a lobster." Alice began to say, "I once tasted," but checked herself hastily and said, "No, never." "So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is." "No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of a dance is it?" "Why," said the Gryphon, "you first form into a line along the seashore." "Two lines!" cried the Mock Turtle. "Seals, turtles, salmon, and so on. Then, when you've cleared all the jellyfish out of the way—" "That generally takes some time," interrupted the Gryphon. "You advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner," cried the Gryphon. "Of course," the Mock Turtle said. "Advance twice, set to partners. Change lobsters and retire in the same order," continued the Gryphon. "Then, you know," the Mock Turtle went on, "you throw the—" "The lobsters!" shouted the Gryphon, with a bound into the air. "As far out to sea as you can." "Swim after them!" screamed the Gryphon. "Turn a somersault in the sea!" cried the Mock Turtle, capering wildly about. "Change lobsters again!" yelled the Gryphon at the top of his voice. "Back to land again!" "And that's all the first figure," said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping his voice, and the two creatures, who had been jumping about like mad things all this time, sat down again very sadly and quietly, and looked at Alice. "It must be a very pretty dance," said Alice timidly. "Would you like to see a little of it?" said the Mock Turtle. "Very much indeed," said Alice. "Come, let's try the first figure," said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. "We can do without lobsters, you know. Which shall sing?" "Oh, you sing," said the Gryphon. "I've forgotten the words." So they began solemnly dancing around and round Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close, and waving their forepaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. "Will you walk a little faster?" said a whiting to a snail. "There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us, with the lobsters, out to sea." But the snail replied, "Too far, too far," and gave a look askance. Said he thanked the whiting kindly, but he would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not, would not join the dance. Would not, could not, would not, could not join the dance. What matters it how far we go? His scaly friend replied. There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch, said Alice, feeling very glad that it was over at last. And I do so like that curious song about the whiting. Oh, as to the whiting, said the Mock Turtle, you've seen them, of course. Yes, said Alice, I've often seen them at She checked herself hastily. I don't know where Din may be, said the Mock Turtle, but if you've seen them so often, of course you know what they're like. I believe so, Alice replied thoughtfully. They have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over crumbs. You're wrong about the crumbs, said the Mock Turtle. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea. But they have their tails in their mouths, and the reason is... Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. Tell her about the reason and all that, he said to the Gryphon. The reason is, said the Gryphon, that they would go with the lobsters to the dance. So they got thrown out to sea. So they had to fall a long way. So they got their tails fast in their mouths. So they couldn't get them out again. That's all. Thank you, said Alice. It's very interesting. I never knew so much about a whiting before. I can tell you more than that if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why it's called a whiting? I never thought about it, said Alice. Why? It does the boots and shoes, the Gryphon replied very solemnly. Alice was thoroughly puzzled. Does the boots and shoes? She repeated in a wondering tone. Why, what are your shoes done with? Said the Gryphon. I mean, what makes them so shiny? Alice looked down at them and considered a little before she gave her answer. They're done with blacking, I believe. Boots and shoes under the sea, the Gryphon went on in a deep voice, are done with whiting. Now you know. And what are they made of? Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. Soles and eels, of course, the Gryphon replied rather impatiently. Any shrimp could have told you that. If I'd been the whiting, said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, I'd have said to the porpoise, keep back, please. We don't want you with us." They were obliged to have him with them, the Mock Turtle said. No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise. "Wouldn't it really?" said Alice in a tone of great surprise. "Of course not," said the Mock Turtle. "Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going on a journey, I would say, 'With what porpoise?'" "Don't you mean purpose?" said Alice. "I mean what I say," the Mock Turtle replied in an offended tone. And the Gryphon added, "Come, let's hear some of your adventures." "I could tell you my adventures beginning from this morning," said Alice a little timidly, "but it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then." "Explain all that?" said the Mock Turtle. "No, no, the adventures first," said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. "Explanations take such a dreadful time." So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it just at first. The two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouths so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about her repeating, "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words all coming different, and then the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said, "That's very curious." "It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Gryphon. "It all came different," the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully. "I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin." He looked at the Gryphon as if he thought it had some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat. 'Tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Gryphon. "How the creatures order one about, and make one repeat lessons," thought Alice. "I might as well be at school at once." However, she got up and began to repeat it. But her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came very queer indeed. "'Tis the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You have baked me too brown. I must sugar my hair. As a duck with its eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons, and turns out his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and will talk in contemptuous tones of the shark. But when the tide rises and sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremulous sound." "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Gryphon. "Well, I never heard it before," said the Mock Turtle, "but it sounds uncommon nonsense." Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way again. "I should like to have it explained," said the Mock Turtle. "She can't explain it," said the Gryphon hastily. "Go on with the next verse." "But about his toes," the Mock Turtle persisted. "How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?" "It's the first position in dancing," Alice said, but was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing, and longed to change the subject. "Go on with the next verse," the Gryphon repeated impatiently. "It begins, 'I passed by his garden.'" Alice did not dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would all come wrong, and she went on in a trembling voice. "I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took pie crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as its share of the treat. When the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl, and concluded the banquet." "What is the use of repeating all that stuff," the Mock Turtle interrupted, "if you don't explain it as you go on? It's by far the most confusing thing I ever heard." "Yes, I think you'd better leave off," said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. "Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille?" the Gryphon went on. "Or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you a song?" "Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind," Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone, no accounting for tastes. Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fellow?" The Mock Turtle sighed deeply, and began, in a voice sometimes choked with sobs, to sing this: "Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Who cares for fish, game, or any other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennyworth only of beautiful soup? Pennyworth only of beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup." chorus again!" cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it, when a cry of "The trial's beginning!" was heard in the distance. "Come on!" cried the Gryphon, and, taking Alice by the hand, it hurried off, without waiting for the end of the song. "What trial is it?" Alice panted as she ran. But the Gryphon only answered, "Come on!" and ran the faster, while more and more faintly came, carried on the breeze that followed them, the melancholy words, "Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup." End of chapter 10.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by R. Francis Smith, Sturgeon's Law, www.sturgeonslaw.com. Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, Chapter 11. The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as a whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the White Rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. "I wish they'd get the trial done," she thought, "and hand round the refreshments." But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. "That's the judge," she said to herself, "because of his great wig." The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. "And that's the jury box," thought Alice, "and those 12 creatures," she was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some were birds. "I suppose they are the jurors." She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. However, jurymen would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the Gryphon. "They can't have anything to put down yet, before the trial's begun." "They're putting down their names," the Gryphon whispered in reply, "for fear that they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things!" Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped hastily, for the White Rabbit cried out, "Silence in the court!" and the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously round to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down "stupid things" on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. "A nice muddle their slates'll be in before the trial's over," thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill the Lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it, so, after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate. "Herald, read the accusation," said the king. On this the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away." "Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. "Not yet, not yet," the rabbit hastily interrupted. "There's a great deal to come before that." "Call the first witness," said the king, and the White Rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and called out, "First witness." The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "I beg pardon, your Majesty," he began, "for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for." "You ought to have finished," said the king. "When did you begin?" The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. 14th of March, I think it was," he said. 15th, said the March Hare. 16th, added the Dormouse. "Write that down," the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. "Take off your hat," the king said to the Hatter. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "Stolen!" the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. "I keep them to sell," the Hatter added as an explanation. "I've none of my own. I'm a hatter." Here the queen put on her spectacles, and began staring at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. "Give your evidence," said the king, "and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot." This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court, but on second thoughts she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. "I wish you wouldn't squeeze so," said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. "I can hardly breathe." "I can't help it," said Alice very meekly. "I'm growing." "You've no right to grow here," said the Dormouse. "Don't talk nonsense," said Alice more boldly. "You know you're growing too." "Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace," said the Dormouse, "not in that ridiculous fashion." And he got up very sulkily, and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers of the court, "Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert," on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off. "Give your evidence," the king repeated angrily, "or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not." "I'm a poor man, your Majesty," the Hatter began in a trembling voice, "and I hadn't begun my tea. Not above a week or so. And what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea—" "The twinkling of the what?" said the king. "It begun with the tea," the Hatter replied. "Of course twinkling begins with the tea," said the king sharply. "Do you take me for a dunce? Go on." "I'm a poor man," the Hatter went on, "and most things twinkled after that, only the March Hare said—" "I didn't," the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. "You did," said the Hatter. "I deny it," said the March Hare. "He denies it," said the king. "Leave out that part." "Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said," the Hatter went on, looking anxiously round to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep. "After that," continued the Hatter, "I cut some more bread and butter." "But what did the Dormouse say?" one of the jury asked. "That I can't remember," said the Hatter. "You must remember," remarked the king, "or I'll have you executed." The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter, and went down on one knee. "I'm a poor man, your Majesty," he began. "You're a very poor speaker," said the king. Here one of the guinea pigs cheered, and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As that is rather a hard word, I will just explain to you how it was done. They had a large canvas bag, which tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig head first, and then sat upon it. "I'm glad I've seen that done," thought Alice. "I've so often read in the newspapers, at the end of trials, there was some attempts at applause, which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court, and I never understood what it meant till now." "If that's all you know about it, you may stand down," continued the king. "I can't go no lower," said the Hatter. "I'm on the floor as it is." "Then you may sit down," the king replied. Here the other guinea pig cheered, and was suppressed. "Come, that finished the guinea pigs," thought Alice. "Now we shall get on better." "I'd rather finish my tea," said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the queen, who was reading the list of singers. "You may go," said the king, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court, without even waiting to put his shoes on. "And just take his head off outside," the queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. "Call the next witness," said the king. The next witness was the duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was, even before she got into the court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. "Give your evidence," said the king. "Sant," said the cook. The king looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, "Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness." "Well, if I must, I must," the king said, with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice, "What are tarts made of?" "Pepper, mostly," said the cook. "Treacle," said a sleepy voice behind her. "Call that dormouse!" the queen shrieked out. "Behead that dormouse! Turn that dormouse out of court! Suppress him! Pinch him! Off with his whiskers!" For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. "Never mind," said the king, with an air of great relief. "Call the next witness." And he added in an undertone to the queen, "Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache." Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. "For they haven't gotten much evidence yet," she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out, at the top of his shrill little voice, the name Alice! End of chapter 11.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's reading, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 12, read by Chris Gorringe. Alice's Evidence. "Here!" cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen onto the heads of the crowd below, and there they lay, sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon!" she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all of the jurymen are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that, in her haste, she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had a little recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates, when the white rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he was trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote it down important, and some unimportant. Alice could see this, as she was near enough to look over their slates, but it doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. At this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, cackled out, "Silence!" and read out from his book, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go, at any rate," said Alice. "Beside, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury, in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come yet, please your majesty," said the white rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What's in it?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the white rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter written by the prisoner to somebody." "It must have been that," said the king, "unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know." "Who is it directed to?" said one of the jurymen. "It isn't directed at all," said the white letter. "In fact, there's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, "It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" asked another of the jurymen. "No, they're not," said the white rabbit, "and that's the queerest thing about it." The jury all looked puzzled. "He must have imitated somebody else's hand," said the king. The jury all brightened up again. "Please your majesty," said the knave, "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end." "If you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like an honest man." There was a general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said that day. "That proves his guilt," said the Queen. "It proves nothing of the sort," said Alice. "Why, you don't even know what they're about." "Read them," said the king. The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, please your Majesty?" he asked. "Begin at the beginning," the king said gravely, "and go on till you come to the end, then stop." These were the verses the White Rabbit read. "They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she would push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2. You gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as we were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest, between yourself and me." "That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet," said the king, rubbing his hands. "And now let the jury, if any one of them can explain it," said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. "I'll give him 6pence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." The jury all wrote this down on their slates. She doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. But none of them attempted to explain the paper. "If there's no meaning in it," said the king, "that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet I don't know," he went on, spreading out the verses on his knee, and looking at them all with one eye. "I seem to see some meaning in them, after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you?" he added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. "Do I look like it?" he said, which he certainly did not, being made entirely of cardboard. "All right so far," said the king, and he went on muttering over the verses to himself. "We know it to be true," that's the jury, of course. "I gave her 1, they gave him 2. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know." "But it goes on, they all returned from him to you," said Alice. "Why, there they are," said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. "Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit. You never had fits, my dear, I think," he said to the Queen. "Never," said the Queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill had left off writing on his slate with one finger, as he found it made no mark, but he now hastily began again, using the ink that was trickling down his face, as long as it lasted. "Then the words don't fit you," said the king, looking round the court with a smile. There was a dead silence. "It's a pun," the king added in an offended tone, and everybody laughed. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the king said, for about the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the Queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." "Stuff and nonsense," said Alice loudly. "The idea of having the sentence first." "Hold your tongue," said the Queen, turning purple. "I won't," said Alice. "Off with her head!" the Queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At this the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the tree upon her face. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice. And she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all these strange adventures of hers that you have just been reading about. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea, it's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still, just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice, and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion. And this was her dream. First she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright eager eyes were looking up into hers, and she could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that queer little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive, the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighbouring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the Queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed around it. Once more the shriek of the griffin, the squealing of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on, with closed eyes, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy. And the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamour of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the after-time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. This is the end of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.